to violence and security issues. He's here today to talk to us about his new book. It's just come out with Cambridge University Press. It's called The Path to Genocide in Rwanda, Security, Opportunity, and Authority in an Ethnocratic State. Without much more words said, Omar, the floor is all yours. Take it away.
Okay. Hi, everybody. And thank you first to Miles and also to Julie, who I think may show up a little bit later, for the invitation. And thank you to all of you out there in the Ethernet for simply showing up to listen to a talk about mass death in the midst of a genocide, as if having enough to listen and contend with, you come and listen to this. So I'm excited to be here. I'm glad to have the opportunity to present this book. Hopefully you can all see and hear me clearly and also see my PowerPoint presentation. So I'm doing this a little bit differently to how I've experienced webinars before. So the book itself addresses two fundamental common questions asked about Rwanda's genocide. How and why did it happen? And how and why did so many Rwandans come to participate in it? So I will speak to those questions, but the more interesting parts of the book actually are separate to those questions. And so hopefully you will have seen that there is a poll for you to ask, in which I'm asking which questions you would like me to answer, because the book is big and it's too much to be able to present, obviously, all of the issues that I treat in it. So what I wanted to try a little bit differently was to give you the opportunity to tell me what you would like me to talk about today. So it's a little bit interactive. And what I will do is I will take the highest ranked question and answer that first, and then give you the chance to ask 2 or 3 questions to get you involved upstream, then move on to the next ranked question and answer questions about that, and so on and so forth until we use up our full 90 minutes. So, and you will see that as I do this, I'll present some quite different pieces of evidence to support some of the claims that I make, the empirical claims that I make, survey data, interviews, life histories, archival data, speeches, GIS data, network data, and I'll try to be as transparent as possible about how I answered those questions using those data. It is Rwanda, it is the genocide. As you might imagine, almost every aspect of this topic is contested or contestable. So I'll try to be as clear as possible. And if I'm not, then I encourage you to ask me questions about it. So I'm going to ask Brenda, who is the IT whiz today, if she might be able to tell me the answers to the questions that have been asked, because I cannot, unfortunately, see the poll results. So Brenda, if you're there in the background, would you just tell me what the top 3 questions were so that I know, and then I will begin to answer them. Aha, they have just appeared on my screen, so let me see. Okay.
So it's why did violence happen so quickly in so many places is the I got the most votes. And then the next one would be why did some Rwandans kill but others not? And then there's a tie, I believe, between did Rwanda's exceptionally high population density contribute and the and was the genocide the product of elite decisions? Those two have a tie.
Right. Well, let's see. The poll is still open, so perhaps by the time, since that's the third one, maybe more people may vote and break that tie. If not, then I'll just flip a coin and answer one or the other. Okay. Right. Good. So before I answer those questions, though, I did want to answer the first big fundamental question in very simple, succinct terms about my take on how and why did the genocide happen. So what I do here is, the answer I give, I kind of trace the causal pathway over time to the genocide itself. And for simplicity purposes, I distinguish them into four major stages. So stage one, as you see on the screen, this is the baseline, the situation in Rwanda before 1990 when the civil war breaks out. And the point that I try to make in this stage of the argument is that Rwanda has this structural vulnerability for conflict that occurs, political conflict, to follow ethnic rather than non-ethnic lines. So it has this high baseline ethnic divisibility risk. The next stage is the period between 1990 and 1994. And this is the emergence and the escalation of an acute threat that arises through the conjunction of these two macro political events, the civil war on the one hand, and then the democratization, political liberalization process on the other. Then on April 6th itself, 1994, the fateful day in which the plane carrying President Habyarimana is brought down, this marks the sudden rupture in the political opportunity structure and creates this power vacuum and power struggle that, as we now know, extremists win, defeating the moderates. And then lastly, once extremists have captured the state, in the fourth stage, it's the implementation of the genocide itself, using the Rwandan state's remarkable authority and capacity. So, if you will see on the left-hand side of the diagram that I borrowed from this metaphor of criminal law, the crime of genocide, so that there's this predisposition, if you like, which is the baseline structural vulnerability. Then there is the motive, which is the acute threat, both a political and a military threat. Then there's the opportunity, which is created when the president is killed. And then lastly, there is the means through which the crime is committed, which is by instrumentalizing the state. So that's the broad overview. I'm going to have a go at showing, obviously the argument is more complex and the process involves multiple steps that I don't highlight here, but I'm going to try to give you a taste of what happens in each of those four different stages. So let's go here. Yeah, so here we go. So this is the structural vulnerability. This whole process begins by recognizing that the susceptibility of Rwanda as a country to division along ethnic boundaries is particularly high. And the reason for this is that Rwanda possesses a number of distinctive structural characteristics that set it apart from other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. There are many, but I want to highlight one in particular, which is Rwanda's ranked ethnic structure, social structure. It's an ethnic hierarchy that was reinforced in the colonial era, and a hierarchy that was very unusually for sub-Saharan Africa. That hierarchy was violently reversed through the revolution upon independence. So it was this distinctive social structure that made ethnicity an unusually powerful force in Rwandan society and politics. There are obviously other social cleavages in Rwanda: class, clan, region, religion, but ethnicity was the dominant fault line, and it meant that any political conflict or political stress that arose in Rwanda would be more likely to follow ethnic rather than non-ethnic boundaries. So that's stage one, a high ethnic divisibility risk because of this unusual ranked ethnic structure in which the Tutsi are perceived as ascendant and the Hutu as subordinate. This ranking was reinforced in the colonial era by the Belgians. Many of you will be familiar with the choices that they made. And lastly, that ranking with Tutsi at the apex and Hutu beneath them was then reversed, bringing into question that hierarchy through the revolution that brought about Rwanda's independence. So that is the baseline. That is what the situation is in Rwanda before the civil war begins in 1990. So that brings us then to the second stage. Here we go, which is what happens between 1990 and 1994. So there are these two major macro political events, the Civil War, which begins in October 1990, and then there's the political liberalization process. Now, their simultaneous occurrence, their conjunction, was just a historical accident, but they represent, that they are causally distinct macro political events. The Civil War, driven in part by the situation in Uganda and the RPF's decision to invade Rwanda, and then the democratization pressures as a result of the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, and the decision by donors to begin to support democratic reforms on the continent. So these two forces, these two macro political events, the Civil War and the political liberalization, so they represent both an external military threat and an internal political threat. And at the beginning, so early on, 1990, 1991, this threat was relatively minor in nature. At the societal level, Rwanda communities were not deeply or widely radicalized, meaning that there wasn't strong anti-Tutsi sentiment in those communities, with the exception of those communities which were on the front lines of the Civil War that had direct experience of the insecurity caused by RPF attacks. Those communities were radicalized, but for the most part, Rwandan communities were not radicalized at the early stages in the 1990-1991. But and in fact, at the beginning, at the political level, it's the same thing. Rwandan politics also were not radicalized at the beginning. The democratization process that led to multipartyism actually gave rise to predominantly moderate ideologies and actually, in fact, encouraged cross-ethnic cooperation at the beginning in those first couple of years. But then as the Civil War and as the liberalization process continues, the schism in this initial phase, which was between reformers and loyalists at the national and local levels, as the threat escalates, the threat deepens and it eventually begins to radicalize Rwandan politics. And it does so because there's simply no external constraint on the escalation of that conflict. So outside of Rwanda, international actors do not intervene with force to contain the fighting. And in fact, they intensify this threat by pressuring the ruling MRND party to democratize. And then inside Rwanda, neither its state institution nor civil society actors act to stop sufficiently extremist actions and extremist rhetoric. And the outcome was then the rise of ethnic extremism. And I should have shown you this in the more detailed diagram as I was talking, but I forgot to press advance on the slide, so apologies. But what you're looking at the moment is the more detailed, complex causal chain that I just described to you verbally for how this acute threat led to the radicalization, as you'll see at the bottom, the radicalization of society and radicalization of politics in those 4 years. So by the time we get to April 1994, Rwandan politics are highly radicalized, having not been so at the beginning. Okay, and that brings us then to stage 3, which is the assassination of the president. So I don't forget here we go. So I don't forget the more detailed causal chain now. So just at the moment when this threat is at its most acute, created by this interaction of the war and the liberalization process, the president is killed, April 6, 1994. So his death is the third major macro political event, causally distinct from, in its effect, from the war and the liberalization process that led to the genocide. So Habyarimana political uncertainty, and it triggered power struggles between ethnic extremists and moderates for control of the state at both the national and at the local levels. And it was in this space of political opportunity that regime extremists began to target moderate Hutu politicians and also Tutsi civilians, whilst at the same time, the RPF, the rebel group, re-engages the civil war by, resumes the civil war by re-engaging government forces. So you have the security threat which escalates, and you also have extremist violence targeting the Tutsi. Again, it was not clear, even at in these early few days, that who would prevail, whether extremists or moderates would prevail, and that genocide would prevail, or would be the outcome. It was because the constraints acting on the extremists were so weak in Rwanda, both domestically and internationally, that allowed extremists to ultimately prevail over the moderates. So the power struggle resolved according ultimately to the relative balance of power, the material capabilities, the coercive capabilities between the extremists and the moderates in those first few days. The extremist faction did hold strategically important positions in the national civilian state apparatus. You know, they, and so did the moderates. But what the extremists had was that they possessed the coercive advantage. They simply commanded superior security forces in the capital. They controlled the Presidential Guard, 2,000 troops, the Power Commando Battalion, the Reconnaissance Battalion, and they were loyal to the extremists, whom everybody at that time believed it was the RPF who had been responsible for assassinating Habyarimana. So the Presidential Guard and those two battalions were incensed that the RPF had done this. So they have the advantage, the extremists have the advantage militarily, and that is why they ultimately are able to prevail at the national level. At the local level, it's slightly different. In communities where moderates hold the advantage, typically because the burgomaster, that's the chief executive at the commune level, belonged to the same party as the extremists, the MRND. So in those situations where extremists were aligned with the national level, then you see the local commune being captured, and we see extremists implementing violence there. But in those communes where the burgomaster belonged to the opposition parties, there the balance of power was in favor of the moderates, and it took extra pressure from the national level, reinforced pressure, to actually co-opt or remove or eliminate those recalcitrant burgomasters, and led to the capture of the state at the local level at a later stage, at a later time. So that's stage 3, how we go from the assassination to the capture of the state by extremists. And then that brings us to the 4th and final stage. So once the extremists have in their possession the control of the apparatus of state, then the plan to commit the genocide is implemented using the state's civilian and military apparatus. So here is the more detailed pathway of how this happens. The state was remarkably powerful in Rwanda, powerful for a sub-Saharan polity. Its authority, its capacity were unusually high for a sub-Saharan country. So it's kind of like a weapon of mass destruction par excellence. So once they have at the national level, once the extremists have captured the state, they directly move to direct the gendarmes, the armed forces, the militia groups to begin targeting Tutsi communities. It's a little bit different at the local level because extremists, even once they've captured the state at the local level, the speed with which the violence occurs, the speed with which mobilization of the population occurs, is actually mediated by the strength of interethnic relations at the local level in the commune. So in those communities where the social cohesion between Hutu and Tutsi is high, typically in the center and the south of the country, in what were then Gitarama and Butare prefectures. So even though extremists were in control of the commune, because it took time to divide those communities because the relations between Hutu and Tutsi were good, and it required actually pressures from outside of those communities, either in the form of intervention by visits from high-profile figures from the center, or sending soldiers or gendarmes or militia from outside of the community to put that community under pressure to force them to take the position that the center wants to. So there's extra local pressures occur. Once that happens, you begin to see the mobilization of the population. It begins with a small minority at first, whom I called critical masses, radical minorities who jumpstart the violence of their community. In those communities which were the highly cohesive socially, this mass mobilization is delayed. But in those communities where the relations between Hutu and Tutsi were poor already, typically in the north, which were on the front lines of the war, and those communities have become radicalized, then you see immediate early mass mobilization. So that then is the answer to that first big question of how and why the genocide happened. That was the kind of very simple answer to the question. I'm going to pause now before I move on to answer the questions that people chose in the poll, to give folks a chance to ask a couple of questions about anything that I have just explained. So let me pause. I should say, if you wish, you can ask questions through the chat, or you can unmute yourself and take off your camera, switch on your camera and ask a question directly. So let me pause and wait a few seconds to see if anything comes through. So just to be certain, Brenda, I don't see any questions in the chat. Can you confirm that's
No.
right?
Yeah,
Yep.
I don't see any questions and no one's raised their hand.
Okay, all right, good. So then I will move on then to the first of the other questions that the poll suggested people wanted me to answer, which was, why did the violence happen so quickly in so many places and involve so many people? So give me a second, because I have to open up that particular presentation. This is where it's not so seamless. So just give me a second whilst I find that presentation. There we go. Yeah. Okay. So, all right. Okay. So hopefully people now can see this presentation. So the question was, why did the violence? It's about the unusual nature of Rwanda's violence. So genocidal violence is fortunately extraordinarily rare, but Rwanda's violence was extraordinary even for a genocide. Its characteristics were both shocking and also puzzling. So, why then did so many Rwandans mobilize so quickly and in so many communities? The speed, the scale, and the scope, the geographic scope, were quite extraordinary. And in fact, I think, if I remember this presentation, yes, I have some slides that give you a sense of just how extraordinary Rwanda's violence and Rwanda's mobilization really were. So what you're looking at here, this graph, is showing you the speed of the violence as it unfolded in Rwanda in one prefecture, Kibuye, one of Rwanda's 11 prefectures. Some of you might be familiar with the data on which this graph is based. It comes from...
We can't see the new slides.
Oh, you can't see the new slides. Apologies, then I have forgot to share my screen. No, it says my screen is sharing. Let's stop sharing that.
Yeah, you're sharing your screen. It was just, I think, maybe the old slides that were showing.
So let me do that again. Apologies. Thank you, Brenda. Okay. How are we now, Brenda? Is it back up?
I can see your screen, but I can see your desktop. There's no PowerPoint. There we go. That's a PowerPoint.
All right, good. Thank you for your patience. So I was explaining then that, yes, what you have here is a graph that shows you just how quickly the violence happened in Rwanda. So the x-axis at the bottom shows you time across those 100 odd days that the violence unfolded during the genocide. And then along the y-axis, you see just how many victims there were. This is based on a survey that was undertaken by the survival organization Ibuka in Kibuye Prefecture a few years after the genocide. I think 98, 99, I think was when the survey was fielded. So what you can see here is quite extraordinary, that most of the violence, so most of the victims were killed in the first 14 days, the first 2 weeks. You'll see that large peak there, right in around about the 13th of April. So even though the genocide itself goes on until the RPF captured the state back in July 18th or 19th, most of the violence actually takes place in the first 2 weeks. So it's very, 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 very quick indeed. I think I have slides on the other characteristics. Yes, the scope of the violence. So this is the geographic ambit, that there were few communities in Rwanda where the violence did not happen. And in fact, what you're looking at there is the map of Rwanda showing the commune boundaries. There were 145 communes in Rwanda back in 1994 at the time of the genocide. And those communes which are shaded red are the communes where violence targeting Tutsi did not occur. And most of you, of course, will realize that the ones there on the northern boundary actually are in the demilitarized zone and behind the war's front lines in territory controlled by the RPF. The only commune you see where violence did not occur that's slightly outside of that demilitarized zone is GT. I don't have a way to, you can see it with this mouse pointer here. I don't know if you see the mouse, but I'm pointing to GT commune's location on the map. And that was for a number of reasons, but one of which is that the RPF, when it broke out of the demilitarized zone on April 7th, this is one of the first communes that it comes to occupy. So that's the geographic scope of the violence. And then, yes, just how many, this is the most distinctive and perhaps shocking feature of Rwanda's violence, is just how many ordinary Rwandans came to participate in it. So what you're looking at here are histograms that show you for each of Rwanda's 11 prefectures just how many Rwandans mobilized or participated in some way in the genocide. They're taken from the Gacaca data, which is the local community justice institution that was set up by the government after the genocide to deal with accountability and also with reconciliation and telling the story of what happened in the genocide. And you'll see that each of the prefectures, each histogram is broken down into these 3 different categories. Category 1 perpetrators under the Gacaca law are those who were the leaders, the serial killers, the more hardened, the more committed killers. Category 2 are also killers, so also people who committed crimes against the person, but who are not in that hardened criminal category. And category 3, those are the number of individuals who committed property crimes. I should say that that number is grossly understated here, as these are actually based on the data that I collected, not the data at the very end. And at this time that I collected these data, the Gacaca process dealing with property crimes had not completed. So that's an underrepresentation, but it gives you a sense nonetheless of just the scale of the mobilization. Looking at, for example, Gitarama there in the middle, close to 100,000 people having participated in the genocide in some way. Okay, so those are the characteristics. So why was Rwanda's violence and why was the civilian mobilization so extraordinary? Well, the answer, I believe, has something to do with what I said at the beginning about the set of extraordinary structural characteristics that Rwanda possesses as a country that sets it apart from other countries on the continent. A set of geographic and demographic characteristics. Rwanda is quite exceptional. So I took the trouble to rank Rwanda against all other sub-Saharan countries on a number of these dimensions, which you see in front of you here. There are too many for me to go through all of them, but I'll highlight a few to give you a taste of how I believe some of these exceptional characteristics account for the exceptional nature of the violence and the mobilization. So first, and perhaps best well known, is that Rwanda was, and I think still is, the most densely populated country in sub-Saharan Africa. You know, its extraordinary density helps explain the extraordinary scale of the civilian mobilization. I explain exactly how, the mechanism, in another presentation, but in short, it had to do with the very dense social networks that linked Rwandans to each other. And these networks amplified the social forces of coercion and cooptation and conformity. Social influence is the result of living in such close proximity to each other. It was simply difficult for Rwandans to escape the horizontal peer pressure to join an attack group and hunt Tutsi. This high population density, by the way, also explains the speed of the mobilization and the speed of the violence, because in such a densely populated country, information diffuses very quickly through these dense social networks. So the logic of contagion was very strong as a result of the population density. A second characteristic that's very distinctive is Rwanda's unusual ethnic settlement pattern, where Hutu and Tutsi lived in relation, Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa lived in relation to each other. So they didn't live in geographically distinct areas of the country, right? There's no distinct separate Hutu land, Tutsi land, or Twa land. Very unusually for sub-Saharan Africa, these three groups, ethnic groups, however you wish to describe them, lived side by side in ethnically mixed communities throughout the entirety of the country. And that's a very distinctive characteristic of Rwanda. So wherever Tutsi lived, this kind of interspersion, this ethnic interspersion, helps explain the extraordinary scope, the geographic scope, the fact that why it happened in so many places, in so many communities across Rwanda, because wherever Tutsi lived, they were targeted. So this ethnic interspersion amplified the distrust and the ethnic distrust and the fear within local communities. So some Hutu would come to suspect their Tutsi neighbors of supporting the rebel RPF and came to believe that their agenda was to reverse that Hutu revolution that marked the emancipation of the Hutu as a class and make the Tutsi the socio-political dominant group once more. So that's what living in close proximity and interspersed, what that meant ethnically for the scale and the speed of the violence. So a third characteristic is simply that Rwanda is, so I'm just seeing in the chat messages coming through. Can we see the slide big rather than like this? I don't think it's big enough to see. That probably was some time ago at this point. I'd moved on. So apologies if it wasn't large enough at that time.
Sorry, we're seeing, I think your screen as you see it. So we see the slide and the next slide and your talking points.
Okay, right. So let me then move back that. I think I have to end that. Do this. Apologies for that. Share that screen. Rwanda's exceptionalism. There. Okay, how is it now? Can you see it? Full
That's
size?
perfect, thank you.
Good, thank you, and apologies I didn't catch that sooner. Okay, I'm actually working with 3 screens, and the chat's on the 3rd screen. I didn't catch that. Okay, so yes, I was talking about the size of the country. So Rwanda being the 4th smallest country in sub-Saharan Africa. So the size of the country made it simply easier for the state to project its power across the territory. It also meant that it was simply easier to travel across the country. So Rwanda, for anybody who has visited it, has the densest road network of any country in sub-Saharan Africa. So if you were to travel, if you wanted to travel to any of the borders with any of the other countries, you could get from almost any point in Rwanda to one of those borders within 3 hours. So these small distances meant that it was easy for political leaders, extremist leaders, for soldiers, for militia groups to move rapidly from the center to the periphery, where they could mobilize the local communities face to face. So this size has something to do, this small size has something to do with the scale of the mobilization. It also meant that there were very few places that were inaccessible or like remote or isolated in Rwanda. So contagion effects were very strong simply because the territory was so small. So this explains partly why the violence happened and took place in so many places across the country. One last one I'll focus on is, yes, the rural nature of the Rwandan society. So in 1994, Rwanda was the most agrarian society in sub-Saharan Africa. It had the lowest level of urbanization, I think, or at least second only to Burundi. I think here you'll see on the table that it is ranked second, that's second to Burundi. And that mattered because there's something quite distinctive about rural social networks that are very different to urban social networks. Obviously, there's much less anonymity and there's much less transiency in rural communities than in urban communities. So Rwandan families knew each other, and they knew each other very well and often stayed in the same location for multiple generations. So this made it really difficult to hide or otherwise escape, your social obligations. And so people knew who you were, they knew where you lived, they knew your ethnicity, they knew what you were doing, they knew what you were not doing. So just as with the extraordinary population density, the fact that Rwanda was so rural and so little urbanized, that this also served to amplify the social influences and helps explain the remarkable popular mobilization. So this last slide, I think, here we go. This kind of summarizes then how each of those characteristics, everything from the boundary continuity to the ecological variability, what the relationship is between those characteristics. And you see on the left-hand side, the characteristics of the violence and the characteristics of the mobilization and how each of those contributed to that. So these were all amplifier effects caused by these rather distinctive characteristics, demographic, geographic, and historical characteristics of Rwanda as a country. So let me pause there again, as that brings me to the end of that presentation, and see if anybody has questions at this stage as well. Again, you can put them through the chat, or you can unmute and turn on your camera and ask a question directly. Okay, I don't see anything in the chat. Wait a few more seconds. Okay. So then the next question, so we can get this slide going now, this presentation going. Why did some kill and others not? So let me get that one. Sec. Here we go. My computer slows down remarkably when I've got Teams and PowerPoint running at the same time. Okay, so that's that opened. Okay, stop that slideshow. Good. Right, so I'll share the right screen this time. And that. Share. And here we go. Okay, right, hopefully I got it right this time. We're now looking at the presentation rather than my view. So, okay, the question of differential selection into the violence. So why some killed and others didn't in Rwanda. So by my calculation, as you see on the screen there, 1 in 4 Hutu men either organized or committed one act of violence during the genocide. I mean, that's a shocking statistic, but that still means that 3 in 4 did not. So what then explains why 25% did come to participate and 75% didn't? So when I first approached this, my initial thinking was that there was something distinctive about the killers, about those who participated in the violence, that they had some distinguishable characteristics, perhaps a distinguishable disposition towards the Tutsi, towards violence that explained why they were selected into the violence. So when I first went to Rwanda to answer this particular question, I chose to do this survey of about 300 Rwandans, both perpetrators and non-perpetrators, and attempt to kind of compare them systematically on a number of dimensions that theory suggests might explain why it is that participants are more likely to have certain characteristics than the non-participants. So I think I have, yes, here we go. So it took a long time. I surveyed the prison population, as well as people from the same communities as the prisoners, but who had not participated in the violence. I can talk a little bit how I identified them if you wish, but it relied upon essentially the Gacaca data, as well as a second in-house survey of a prison Gacaca that also happened as well, parallel to it. But what you're looking at here is the headline results from a very lengthy and time-consuming survey that systematically compared the participants with the non-participants, these 300 Rwandans, on by asking them, I think, almost 200 questions. It took many interviews with each of them to get through the questionnaire to try to understand whether they had distinguishable characteristics. And to cut a long story short and a very painful piece of fieldwork short, at the end of it, I came to the finding that there was very little that distinguished the participants from the non-participants in terms of their dispositions or their characteristics. As you can see there, I was looking at these 5 broad clusters of theories or hypotheses for why it is that certain individuals might be selected into the violence and others not. So to do with racism and prejudice and ethnicity, to do with deprivation, to do with perceptions of insecurity and fear, and then lastly, their orientation to authority and whether they felt they had been coerced or not. And on all of those different questions that I asked, I found no statistically significant differences in the answers given by the participants and the non-participants. The only and unsurprising difference that I found was in respect of age and gender, where the participants in the violence were more likely to be young and overwhelmingly to be male, but that's hardly surprising. So it basically confirmed, I suppose, the scholarly consensus that the killers were quite ordinary, at least in their attitudes, or so it seemed. So that still didn't answer the question, though, of why then, if they are so similar in their attitudes and in their beliefs and in their demographic characteristics, then what does explain why some came to kill and others not? So I began to rethink the way that I was approaching this question. And instead of assuming that it was who you were, I hypothesized that maybe it was where you lived, a situational hypothesis, and perhaps who you knew, a relational hypothesis. And I went back to Rwanda for a second bout of fieldwork, and I returned to one of the communities that I knew very well in the south of the country, in Butare, Sector Tare, which is a community of 3,500 Rwandans. And what you're looking at there now, hopefully, is a map showing the boundaries of sector Tare. It's a community that I knew who the participants were, who those who did not participate were, and also who the victims and who the survivors were. And what I did is hire a team of geographers who went through and geocoded the household locations of each household as they existed and as where they resided in April of 1994. And what you're looking at here is the results of that geocoding exercise. I'm not certain how visible it is to you on your screens, but the red crosses represent the victims of the violence in Sector Tare. The green dots or circles represents those individuals who we believe did not participate in the violence. And then last of all, those pink circles or dots. The pink is very faint on my screen, but you may not be able to see it so clearly. But they represent those perpetrators, those who did participate in the violence. So just eyeballing this map doesn't really give you a clear sense of whether there is some pattern in the distribution and the settlement patterns of the killers and the non-killers and the victims. So I try to look at this more systematically using some quantitative techniques. So what you're looking at here is my attempt to build neighborhoods. So you'll see that around each of those households, the victim households, the perpetrator households, and the non-participant households, I drew these circles of different radii, starting at 100 meters, then to 200, to 300, to 400, to 500, and basically creating this perimeter around a household and counting who lived in this perimeter, who lived in this micro neighborhood, as it were, who lived within 100 meters, who lived within 200 meters, who lived within 300 meters. And what I found was that the killers tended to live in the same neighborhoods. So if there was a participant in the violence in a household, within up to 300 meters of that household, you would find more participants than you will find non-participants. So participants are overrepresented in that particular neighborhood, and that neighborhood effect persisted up until about 300 meters. And beyond 300 meters, the effect tapered off. So at 400 meters and 500 meters, we don't find the statistically significant result of the overrepresentation of killers in those neighborhoods. So, so this was my first hypothesis then, that it was about where you lived that mattered. And indeed, I found then some evidence to support this finding that where you lived did have an impact on whether you were likely to be drawn into the violence again. The question is then, well, why? And I believe it had something to do with social influence. And these neighborhoods that I've constructed at 100, 200, and 300 meters, that these are microspheres of influence. And so individuals are drawn into the violence because they are influenced by those people who live in that neighborhood. So I wanted to test then this second hypothesis, that it was who you knew that mattered also for differential selection into the violence. So I went back into Sector Tare to map the social networks of a subset of the 3,500 Rwandans who lived in that community. So I mapped the social networks. I sampled 130 community members, and I mapped their social networks. In other words, I asked them to identify who the people were in their family, who their friends were, who they had economic ties to, who they had political ties to, who they had religious ties to. Did they go to the same church? Did you work for somebody? Who did you drink with? And we went through and we mapped them by name, and for these killers and these non-killers. And we found, hallelujah, after doing all this work, that there was indeed a systematic difference between the social networks of the killers, of the perpetrators, and the non-perpetrators. And the most important structural difference is in the size of these networks. So perpetrators, somewhat counterintuitively, had bigger social networks than the non-participants in the violence. They simply knew more people in their community. I also found that certain types of ties mattered because we also enumerated or qualified the ties, whether they were political, religious, economic, social, family-based, neighborhood-based. We qualified the types of connections that these individuals had to each other. And we found that the strongest predictors of participation then were individuals who had family kinship ties and neighborly ties to other participants in the violence. We also found, and this was the third finding, that the strength of the tie also mattered, not just the type of tie, but also the strength of the tie. So looking at kinship ties, for example, we also quantified the degrees of consanguinity. So whether you're talking about somebody who is your father or your brother or your child, so first degree of consanguinity. So those were stronger predictors of participation than, say, aunts or cousins or grandparents, second degrees of consanguinity. So the strength of the tie, as you might imagine, theory would predict, also mattered for predicting whether you were likely to be influenced and to be drawn into the violence or not. So we have this somewhat counterintuitive finding that those who were socially isolated were more likely to be drawn into the violence than those who were socially better connected. So the pro-social were more likely to participate in the violence. So social capital having a dark side. I call it anti-social capital in the book. How did these networks work? Well, the mechanisms were quite varied, and I relied largely on my interview data to kind of infer what was going on. Why did these networks matter? And I'll give you a couple of examples. One mechanism was simply that these social ties allowed information to be diffused from one person to another. So I give you here is an interview with a couple, a husband and wife, who are telling me about actually one of the main mobilizers, one of the main leaders of the genocide in Sector Tare. His name was Emmanuel Rekaraho, who's also a politician. So I asked them, what was Rekaraho's attitude towards the Tutsi like? So the husband says, well, on the 10th of April, there was this baptism of a Tutsi baby, and Rekaraho was conducting the ceremony. So imagine, this is after the president has been killed, 4 days after. In Butare in the south, they're still holding baptisms. And a Hutu is the one who is conducting the baptism of a Tutsi child. So it puts into perspective the quality of the interethnic relations in this community at the beginning. The evening before, he went to Kambanda's, that's the Tutsi father, to Kambanda's house, and there he even offered a cow to a young Tutsi boy who was single still, and said he would ask for a girl's hand in marriage. So he had good relations with the Tutsi. So then I asked, well, when did he change? And then the wife answers, and she says, well, he attended these meetings in Butare town, and that's when he changed. Well, what kind of meetings, I asked? Well, they were secret meetings involving other politicians. And so when did it change here in Sector Tare? Well, then Rekaraho began to hold these secret security meetings at his house with members of the MDR party here and some of his old soldier friends. And that's how the genocide started here in Tare. So what Ariel and his wife Beatrice are telling us is that Rekaraho at the beginning was not predisposed against the Tutsi. He was not instigating violence or against the Tutsi. Quite the opposite. He was, maintaining good social relations with them. But it was only when he was invited through his political party network to participate in this meeting outside of the community that he came back with this information now that the Tutsi were to be targeted. And that's when he changed, and that's when he began the mobilization inside the community. So his network, his extra community network here mattered then for bringing information into the community about how the Tutsi were to be treated A second mechanism, and this is the last one on this presentation, is about recruitment appeals, that individuals recruited individuals by appealing to them through their networks. So this is an interview I had with a man, the name is anonymized here, fictional name, Deogratius, insectataria again. So he's somebody who participated on the roadblocks, which were infamous in Rwanda as being the site or location for many of the killings. So Deogratius, who told you to man that roadblock? It was the responsable of the cellule. So that's the local village head, as it were, in Rwanda. His name is Sibomana. So how did Sibomana summon you to the roadblock? Well, it was before the umuganda, that's the compulsory labor practice in Rwanda, that he came to my house and told me that I had to work on that roadblock. He said, no one must stay at home. Do you live near Sibomana? Yes, I live nearby. How far? It's on a hill. I live at the bottom and Sibomana lives near the top. But you can call from one to the other. Do you have any family ties to Sibomana? No. We had an alliance founded on religion. Sibomana's mother was the godmother of my sister. Do you have any economic ties to Sibomana? Did you work for him? I wasn't poor. I didn't work for Sibomana. Were you friends with him? Yes. Well, how did you first know Sibomana? Well, we grew up together on the same hill and we kept cows together and we went to each other's houses because Sibomana's mother was the godmother of my sister. So here you have an example of how two individuals, Sibomana and Deogratius, are connected. It's a family tie. It's the god, it seems, and a neighborly tie. They live close to each other, top and bottom of the hill, and they're connected through the godmother as well. And so Sibomana calls upon Deogratius to come and join him on the roadblock. So that then is a second mechanism for how social networks mattered. I should say finally, on this question of differential selection, why some killed and others didn't, I've emphasized situational and relational factors, where you lived and who you knew, because I could not find dispositional differences between the participants and the non-participants in my survey. But I should say that the survey, I now know, is biased because I relied on the prison population, which are problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, as I say on this slide, it only actually have imprisoned a very small, about less than a quarter of all of those whom we believe participated in the violence. Only a quarter of them actually were imprisoned. And as I'll show in another presentation, if we get to it, I also identified 160 of the local leaders in communities across Rwanda by name. And of those 160, I found that 2/3 of them were not in prison at all. So only 1/3 of them in prison. That means 2/3 were still at large, probably in the DRC or outside of Rwanda somewhere. And it was also clear that the majority of those who were imprisoned were not the serial or the hardened killers. And I think I can show you here, I sampled some of these prison inmates and tried to, I tried to quantify just how many deaths they were involved in. And what you see here is their kill rates for 69 of these sampled participants. You'll see that the vast majority, that almost half of them, 48% of them, were involved in only the death of one other person. These are not individuals then who were the serial killers, the repeat killers, and so forth. So it would be too much to say then that disposition did not matter. In fact, I asked in my survey some questions to see if there were dispositional differences between persons. So I asked the participants to tell me about some of the attitudes towards the violence that people had. And it became apparent that there were clearly distinguishable individuals. So here are some of the survey responses. So the first one there is just, I asked them about sadists, simply were there people who enjoyed or took pleasure in the killing. And out of the respondents, nearly 80% say yes, there were people who took pleasure in the killing of the Tutsi. So we definitely have dispositionally some sadists people reported existed. I also asked whether they had extremists, ideological extremists, people who were very committed to killing Tutsi. And you see there again a very large percentage saying how many individuals like that existed in their communities. 56.3% saying that they number between 1 and 10 individuals in the community. So we have extremists. I also asked about whether people thought that some people joined these attack groups because they thought they would get land. So these are kind of material opportunists. And again, we see that there was some, not a large percentage, very small this time, about 10% who said that yes, there were some people who joined because they thought they would be able to take advantage of the opportunity to get land. And I also asked lastly about pacifists, refuseniks, people who refused to participate in the violence, whether that such people existed in their community. And you'll see there that yes, about a third said that there were individuals like that in their community. So all of that to say is that even though I find situational and relational factors to be important, there were still, disposition did seem to matter. There were dispositional differences. There was heterogeneity among the perpetrators. And I think crudely, yes, I classify them here into extremists, opportunists, conformists, and resistors. So that brings me to the end of that question, the second question. So let me once again pause and see if people want to ask questions, either through the chat or directly. Okay, one question came in. Yeah. So I'm not certain if everybody can see it, but I'll just read it out. You mentioned that participants were overwhelmingly male. Do you have a sense of women's participations and motivations? There is little data on this beyond the African Rights Report and scattered scholarship. I'm writing an article about Pauline's and women's participation at the moment, and it seems to me there's a gap here that is perhaps difficult to research because of prevailing conceptions of femininity. Yeah. One minute. Gender. Miles asks again about gender. And then the communities, Congo. Okay. And then David asks about research about Hutu communities in the Congo and what needs to be done. Is there Hutu vengeance against Tutsi for being evicted? Okay. All right, let's take those questions then. So, gender. So I think it would be a mistake to assume that because women were not in the prison population or counted very few among the participants in physical violence committed, to believe that somehow that they were opposed or did not support what was happening. Remember, most of these men who participated were in fact husbands and fathers. It wasn't, by the way, a majority of young, isolated men. The profile, the demographic profile, which I didn't present here, it's in another presentation, shows that the average age is between 35 and 44. So these are men who have families. So they have wives and they have children. And they would come home to their wives at the end of the day after one of their going out to these attack groups, and they would be comforted by their wives, or some conversation would take place between them. And I also encountered many stories of victims, Tutsi victims, who were outed in their communities by women. Women who spied them or saw them hiding in certain places in the community, whether it's in the swamps, whether it was in latrines, in the roofs of people's houses, but they would be denounced and outed. So I think it's a mistake simply to assume that because they're not counted among the participants in physical violence, to think that they did not share in some of the thinking, the attitudes, the beliefs, the group thinking that was going on during those 100 days inside those communities. So that's my belief about ordinary women. That I think that there is work to be done here in trying to understand the role that they played, particularly as wives, during the violence that took place in some of these communities. So let me take David's question, which is about Hutu communities in the Congo and about retributive violence against Tutsi. So yes, obviously there's a very large community of Rwandan Hutu still at large, perhaps not the right term. It sounds as if they are guilty of something. It's not necessarily only genocidaire or militia or soldiers and who were involved in the genocide who are still at large. There are simply Hutu communities who were part of that 2 million, part of those 2 million individuals who were part of the exodus out of Rwanda as the RPF moved in and captured the country commune by commune and prefecture by prefecture. So much of the questions I usually get are actually about violence against the Hutu in the DRC rather than distributed violence against Tutsi there. And there, for sure, there is a lot more work that needs to be done because we do not have a strong sense yet of what took place and on what scale inside the DRC after the genocide. Because we often think of the genocide as the defining period of violence in the Great Lakes region at that time. But if you were to cast a wider lens and expand that lens to include what's going on in the DRC, in Burundi, in Uganda, and not only in those 100 days, but both before and also after, then we have a very different picture of the scale and the targeting of the violence there. And the most consequential period being 96 to 2003 in the DRC, with a systematic targeting of Hutu communities there. The best evidence we have on this is the UN mapping report, but even that is problematic for a number of reasons. They didn't make a